at the end of which there will be an opportunity for questions. So if you have burning questions that you want to commit to paper, as it were, before they finish speaking, then please use the chat function at the bottom of the screen. Otherwise, if you're happy to wait until after the presentation, there'll be about 20-25 minutes for chat at that point. And the session is being recorded, so remember, careless talk, etc. Okay, if I can hand over, I think first to Matthew, then we'll get going.
Right, thank you very much, Bernard, for the introduction. I'd just like to start by saying we're delighted, Volunteer Scotland, to have the opportunity to share some of our evidence with the university and the delegates that have joined today. We've got, as you said, we've got a long-standing relationship with the university, and it's one that's very important to us. And this is a nice little interface we've got today. I just think, just before we start, just let's say a little bit. Volunteer Scotland, for those who don't know, we're the national development body really for volunteering. We're supporting volunteering because we believe in it as good for both the volunteer and for society. As part of that, research is a key part of our key service offer to the government and to our partners. And you are talking to the research team, which is about 1.5 full-time equivalents, which is Debbie and myself. And we're involved in basically using a lot of secondary data and using other partners' data. We do a bit of primary research, but it's very modest. So what you've got today is some examples of analysing of other people's data and evidence and interpretation of that. So we can just move on, Debbie, thanks. So really the scope of the session today, we've got a kind of volunteering setting the scene, which Debbie's going to lead on, and then going to pass over to myself, who's going to talk about research. We've done 2 pieces of research relating to health and well-being benefits and the linkage to volunteering pre-COVID. Debbie's then going to move the focus onto what can we learn during COVID, and then I'll come in at the end, just say a little bit on overarching conclusions. So that's really sets the scene. So without any further ado, put on your seatbelts, fasten on. We're ready for a roller coaster ride here. Over to Debbie.
Thank you, Matthew. So we're going to start today just by setting the scene for what Matthew's going to talk about by looking at just some volunteering overall in Scotland. So the first thing is, what is volunteering? So the Volunteering for All national framework from the Scottish Government defines volunteering as a choice to give time or energy, a choice undertaken of one's own free will, and a choice not motivated for financial gain or for a wage or salary. So really what we're saying is giving unpaid time to help others. And we can think of volunteering almost on a scale from very informal volunteering, which some people see as neighbourliness. So as an individual helping someone who lives close by to you, you might volunteer kind of informal or semi-formally, with others spontaneously, with others in a more regular or organised way. This is something that's been more important during COVID-19 and the growth of mutual aid, people organising themselves in informal groups to help others within their local area. Or you might volunteer formally, and that's through a constituted organisation or charity. So volunteering through something like the NHS, or giving some time at a charity shop. So in terms of volunteering in Scotland, formally 26% of adults gave time to volunteering in 2018. That was equivalent of 1.2 million Scottish adults. They gave 150 million hours of time, and that had an economic value of £2.3 billion. For informal volunteers, 36% of Scottish adults, or 1.6 million adults, gave time. That was 211 million hours of time and £3.2 billion to the Scottish economy. This shows the importance of volunteering, not just to help others, but the economic benefits to the Scottish economy. If we move on to look at a few demographics which highlight some differences in volunteering in Scotland. And if we start with age range, we can see that for both formal and informal volunteering, those that are aged 35 to 44 have the highest participation rates, and those aged 75 plus have the lowest participation rates. We also see that females have higher formal and informal participation rates than males, and this is a well-established trend going back to 2007. Females have always had higher volunteer participation rates in Scotland. If we move on to look at deprivation as measured by SIMDQ, so this ranks areas in Scotland from quintile 1, which is the 20% most deprived, to quintile 5, Q5, which is the 20% least deprived. And we see for formal and informal volunteering that those in the most deprived areas have lower participation rates, and those in the most deprived areas have the lowest participation rates, and those in the least deprived areas have highest participation rates. It's interesting to note that for informal volunteering, the difference between the most and least deprived is 7%, which is lower than that for formal volunteering at 11%. If we move to look at urban and rural, those living in rural communities have higher participation rates than those living in urban areas, both formally and informally. And again, this is a well-established trend in Scotland, where those living in rural areas have had higher participation rates all the way back to 2007. So the next question we're going to think about is, do all volunteers give the same amount of time? In Volunteer Scotland, we measure this through the civic core, and that's high intensity volunteers who contribute 16 or more hours in the past 4 weeks. For formal volunteering, we can see that 18% of volunteers are given 64% of total volunteering hours, and 17% of informal volunteers are given 69% of all informal hours. So we've got a really small percentage of volunteers delivering the majority of hours. And it's interesting to consider, does this have health and well-being impacts? And Matthew's going to have some more details on this later. If we then move on to look at why Scottish adults volunteer, the words that kind of come out most when we ask people why they want to volunteer, they want to improve things, they want to help those in need, there's a cause that is important to them, they feel they want to give their time to. So adults are volunteering to improve things, they're volunteering to help others, support causes they hold as important. It's more altruistic benefits than benefits to themselves from gaining skills or experience. There's also an important aspect around community. People are volunteering because they felt there was a need in their community. Pre-COVID-19, this was 30% of adults in Scotland. During COVID-19, and we'll come on to more details on this later, this has increased massively. If we look at the benefits from volunteering, people are volunteering because they enjoy it. They feel it makes a difference to them. They're meeting new people. They're having personal achievements, broadening life experience. But there's also big improvements to health. There's improvements to mental health and well-being. People feel less isolated through volunteering. It even improves people's physical health. Matthew is now going to talk us through some of these in some more detail.
Thanks, Debbie. So I've got my section here is cut into two. The first bit is looking at evidence from UK and international based on literature review we did back in 2017-18, and it's going to focus on the impact on volunteers themselves and their own health and well-being. Next slide. So when we started this exercise, we went in as much as research as can, with tried to keep a completely open mind and put all kind of preconceptions to one side. But we were really assailed as a national body with the language we were engaging with people was very much volunteering is a good thing. It's good for beneficiaries and volunteers. It's positive in terms of health and well-being. And basically the argument is more is better. But I mean, we had to ask fundamentally, I mean, are there benefits? Who benefits? How do they benefit? And particularly importantly, are there losers as well as winners? So we tried to be as independent and dispassionate as we could be in assessing the evidence. So basically, we had about 100 papers, and then we sifted down to effectively 24 core papers, which had real quality and depth. And these little colored bubbles that you see in here highlight a range of, these were common across these 24 papers. And they really classify into issues about connecting with people, helping others, developing their skills and confidence, and having fun. So these were the things that the people were getting out of volunteering. And what the papers were showing us was that those factors were influencing directly into both improved mental health and physical health, but also reducing social isolation and loneliness. When it came to community well-being, there was much less research on this, and that's why there's a question mark there. But this is an area that we think is particularly important, and one that we can maybe come back to in our Q&A at the end. So if we could just look a little more closely at the three main domains that focused on this literature review. So we went in with an open panel, as it were, and we said, what are the issues? And these are the ones that were coming out of the papers. And if we look at them, if we look at social connectedness, volunteering by its very nature is a people business. It's about meeting people, making friends. For a lot of people, it's got a benefit of just getting them out of the house, particularly for older people, and that feeling of belonging. And in mental health, the papers came out with some really interesting stuff on different categories of mental ill health, including anxiety, depression, PTSD, and learning disabilities. When it comes to physical health, there's a range of factors. These are just some, but it's about actually the pure process of volunteering. In many volunteering roles, it has involved activity and it relates to fitness, but it also examples of actually inculcating healthy behaviors. And then there's also, for older people in particular, the giving them functional independence and the ability to cope with illness. So those are real positives, and you see this little yellow smiley face. This was one of the academic papers we looked at, coined way back, I think it was in 1990, this idea of the helper's high, and that's as a return that the individual gets from the role of volunteering. At the bottom, though, what we didn't expect, and which we weren't looking for, was 4 papers actually examined the issue of life expectancy, which was quite fascinating, and actually came out with actual correlations. These were quantitative studies of correlating people's engagement in volunteering with a longer life expectancy. However, we have to say there's question marks here about the transmission mechanism for volunteering to achieving that. It was actually far from clear, but interesting evidence nonetheless. Okay, just want to cover here, what is it that can actually help foster health and well-being? And these are 4 of the most important things that came out of the review. This is interesting, there's quite a lot of the analogy, you go to the medical context. So this dose response effect was cited in a number of papers, and that links to the idea that health and well-being and volunteering, but what you're saying in common sense terms is you need to actually be doing a reasonable amount of volunteering to actually get a benefit. You know, the one-off helping an event once a year is not really going to cut it. So it's about having some regular volunteering and putting in, 2 or 3 hours a week, doing something that's really going to make give you a chance for those benefits to affect the individual. Other ones is very important is that those that enter volunteering for altruistic reasons, helping others rather than helping themselves, the evidence was much stronger in terms of deriving health and well-being benefits. And then clearly recognition, we all like to be thanked, whether it's in employment or in volunteering, and the same applies in volunteering, that ability to be appreciated and recognized. And then last but not least, the role itself is very important. So it's the type of role. So roles in volunteering that engage with people, with communities, that have got clear responsibilities where people can see that they're making a difference and that that's generating a return is very important. But also, we also looked objectively at this sort of what are the potential downsides, and there are some downsides here for certain situations, particularly where volunteers are involved in undertaking multiple roles and are under stress, where they're putting in too many volunteering hours, where their physical health could be compromised, particularly for older volunteers. We have to be careful about what the roles are being demanded of them. And last but not least, particularly relevant in the current COVID world, challenging and emotionally demanding roles. And you'll see on the right-hand side here an interesting graph from an author, Van Willigen, back in 2000, where he studied and looked at the the benefits on the vertical axis of life satisfaction, the higher the figure, the greater this life satisfaction indicator, and the bottom is the volunteering hours. And it's interesting, for those that are age 60 and above, there's a linear increasing positive relationship. Whereas for those that are age 60 and under, you can see this curvilinear relationship. So it starts to increase up to about 100 hours and then drops off. And by the time it gets to 140 hours, they're actually back to where they started in terms of life satisfaction. Indeed, the conclusion is that for some volunteers, it'd be better off, their health and well-being would improve if they stopped volunteering. So it's quite an interesting dynamic about the volume and the intensity of volunteering to generate health and well-being benefits. And the last thing I want to put in this section is it was quite reassuring. The year later that we did our research, the University of Stirling came up, and you can see on here, this is an excerpt from their literature review, which was quite a large systematic review of volunteering to help the Scottish Government in the development of the Volunteering for All framework. And you'll see in here, they came up with exactly the same categories of physical health, mental health, and the social benefits and isolation. So that's reassuring. And then I think we also, I think it was January of this year, and the What Works Centre for Wellbeing linked in with a number of universities, and NCVO published it's almost like a mirror report that we had published. Now, I'm not sure whether it actually looked at us, but it was very helpful because I mean, serious aside, it was actually very interesting that they're coming out with indeed a diagrammatic model which is mirrors to the one that we'd produced. So it was rather reassuring that the evidence we looked at through much larger academic studies came out and reinforced and validated our conclusions. Okay, so that's us talked about that piece of research. We came out of that and we sort of scratched our head and said, that's all fine and dandy. What about what's going on in Scotland? Can we kind of make tartanize see what's really going on within Scotland? So if we can move on to the next slide. We decided to stick with the three key axes of on the left-hand side. And what we looked at was the impact on volunteers of health and well-being versus the impact that volunteers have on the health and well-being of others. Also had a look, although it's more limited, on community health and well-being, and lastly on deprivation. So for this diagram, the key thing I want to bring out here, on the top left, we've got in the sort of light blue color, that these are the volunteers that Debbie highlighted at the beginning who are volunteering. These are adults that are volunteering at least once in the last year. Quite a proportion of those volunteering a lot more intensively than that. And this is looking at the health and well-being benefits that they derive themselves. And that's what we're going to go on and look at in the rest of my presentation. Debbie's going to expand that out to look at the impact that COVID's had on the colors on the right here, or down below in the kind of light yellow, which is the benefits that volunteers confer through the volunteering that they do themselves. So if you look at the bottom row here, we know that in a typical year, we've got over 200,000 formal volunteers supporting physical activity and sports clubs and events, you name it, across Scotland. A similar number for health and social care, from the NHS to chest, heart and stroke to this, to a small healthcare charity. And then on the right-hand side, it's interesting, we've got for both formal volunteers about 100,000 and nearly 300,000 informal volunteers, helping reduce social isolation and loneliness in society. And that last point there on informal is particularly important, has come to light in the COVID world, of the really important contribution which informal volunteering has made. So looking at volunteer participation, so some of the statistics that Debbie produced at the beginning, on the left-hand graph here, it shows a linear relationship. It's a positive correlation between improved health and increased volunteering. But we would really want to caution a word of caution here on the causality problems. And we are not saying that engaging in volunteering improves health on this statistic at all for society at large. I think this is much more likely to be reverse causality, where we've got a situation which those that are predisposed to have stronger health and well-being are more likely to engage in volunteering. Now, this is unprovable as far as we can find out, and indeed any of the academics are struggling as well. but our subjective judgment suggests that the reverse causality is one of the major factors. There will be an element of improving health as well, and the evidence tells us from their academic research. But that's just interpreting that. And on the right-hand side, if we look at the data here, this shows that there's also a linear but an inverse relationship between deprivation and volunteering participation. So the more deprived the area is in SAMDQ1, the lower the volunteering participation rates. And this is for each of the indicators, depending whether you've got bad or very bad health through to very good or good. So that's general health. Looking at volunteering participation and loneliness, similar situation here on the left, again, a linear function. And on the right, what we have here is, again, for those that are not quite so lonely, you know, none or almost none or some, there's again, you can see an issue where it's higher in deprived areas. What's interesting is in the bottom graph, it's almost like a V shape, or probably would be a U shape, is effectively that for SIMD1, the most deprived areas in Scotland, 20% most deprived, they're actually slightly, you know, it's higher than it is in SIMDQ3. And we don't know the answer for this, but we would suggest, surmise that this may be linked to the extra support that deprived areas get through local authorities and third sector interfaces and all the support that goes in. And we've got some first-hand experience of that from Glasgow, from the analysis we've done. And then this is the third sort of axis we're looking at here is the linkage between deprivation and health. In this instance, we've just looked at mental health. And you can see from this that for SIMD quintile 1, it shows the proportion of the population on the left-hand side, the various indicators of mental health. And you'll see quite a marked variation between quintile 1 and quintile 5. And if you haven't done this, I would really encourage anyone that it's worth an hour to go through the Scottish Health Survey and scan through that. And in Bridgings, it shows in spades the level of the health inequalities we have in Scotland. And to seeing the data at first hand is quite sobering. I think this is an important part of our evidence base that we draw upon in the conclusions we come to. So the last slide I've really got here is what I've called the kind of catch-22. I mean, effectively what we have in society and drawing upon this evidence, this is really a model, we can't prove this, but the evidence would suggest us, the kind of my hypothesis is that those that are advantaged in society, those that are the ABC1 sociodemographics, those that are in employment, those with good social capital, generally, and this is a broad assessment, but generally their health and well-being is higher, their volunteering participation is higher, and they're also benefiting. There's quite a lot of people are benefiting, because there's quite a large number in that category. However, we have to qualify this, that our estimate and understanding is that the benefit they get is much more modest. However, when we look at the disadvantaged or excluded in society, those who are unemployed, etc., and they're suffering various elements of exclusion, their health and well-being is low, the volunteering participation is low, and the impact on them is very few are benefiting. However, the impact is extremely high and it can be life-changing, in fact, life-saving in some instances. And this is particularly based on the evidence, which we haven't got time to share today, but on a wide range of qualitative research, which we've examined, including James Davis's own PhD research at the University of Strathclyde. So I suppose the reason I'm calling this a catch-22 is where actually there's no whichever option you take, it's a difficult one. There's going to be losers. So if you go down the left-hand model in the blue, you're going to spread your benefits thinly. If you try the right-hand model, it's actually very, very challenging, because actually to try and reach and engage those that are most disadvantaged in volunteering is a really big challenge. That's all for that. Over to you, Debbie.
So we're going to have a look at health and wellbeing contribution of volunteers during COVID-19 now. If we think of volunteering during COVID-19, we can kind of think of it in a 3-tier response model. So COVID-19's impacted on individuals, communities, and societies. People's needs have been wide and they've been really, really complex in some cases. We've had people who've had to shield, we've had people who have been lonely and isolated, people with worsening mental health issues, and then we've had more practical problems. So we've people who've needed food support, people who've needed transport, people who need things like prescriptions picked up. to enable them to carry on their daily activities. And where's the COVID-19 response come from? It's come from informal volunteers. Informal volunteer participations increased during COVID-19. It's come from mutual aid groups, so groups of people that have come together mainly through social media like Facebook to help people in their local communities. Mutual aid has never been measured in the Scottish Household Survey, so we don't have a baseline figure for it, but we know that this has grown massively. There were hundreds of mutual aid groups set up in Scotland within the first few weeks of the pandemic. And formal volunteering played an important part as well, but formal volunteers retracted, particularly during the initial stages of COVID-19. Social distancing, shielding of beneficiaries, and the way services were previously offered weren't as suited to formal volunteering. So we saw formal volunteer participation rates drop. If we look at total volunteer participation pre-COVID-19 from our Ipsos Murray survey was 45%. This rose by 29% to 74% in March to June of 2020. So it's pretty incredible to think that 3/4 of Scottish adults during that time period gave time to volunteer to help others through COVID-19. If we look at the volunteer activities that have been undertaken during COVID-19, the most frequently cited activity that's been undertaken is befriending or keeping in touch with someone who's at risk of being lonely. 68% of the Scottish population undertook this activity. That's 2.2 million adults. It's important to note that the survey and the data that we're using in this slide comes from March to June 2020. This is when we're in the throes of the crisis response. So things have changed slightly since then. Befriending or keeping in touch with someone who's at risk of being lonely can be undertaken by all types of volunteers. It could be someone volunteering informally on their own, checking on a neighbour, right through to the type of help that Chest, Heart and Stroke have done by involving hundreds and thousands more volunteers in their telephone lines. It's interesting to note that helping at organisations which supported people's physical and mental health, only 12% of adults were involved in this activity during this time, and we feel that this shows the contraction in formal volunteering that was predominant, particularly during the initial crisis response to COVID-19. If we move on to look at the societal impacts of COVID-19, now this data is taken from excuse me, the Oscar Charities Survey, so it's only charities. We believe that these figures would be much higher if it was a survey of the whole of the third sector, but we can see that charities are most concerned about increased loneliness and isolation, higher levels of anxiety about the future, worsening mental health and well-being, and worsening physical health and well-being. They're less concerned over financial issues around increased hardship and vulnerability, increased unemployment and redundancy. It's mental health and it's physical health that are coming out as the concerns that COVID-19 have caused now and in the future. And as well as the health and well-being concerned for beneficiaries, charities are concerned about their own staff, their own trustees, and their own volunteers. As Matthew mentioned before, volunteer burnout can become a real issue. 14% of charities in Scotland are experiencing this currently, and that's dealing from the emerging needs of COVID. It's been long, it's been over a year. People have been dealing with extremely tough issues. 30%, almost a third of charities are feeling that they have extra challenges to ensure the mental health and well-being of volunteers to be able to cope with this. And 21% of charities have stated an increased need for mental health and well-being support for their staff, their volunteers, their beneficiaries and trustees, and that was of November 2020. If we look to the future and beyond COVID-19, we asked the question in our Ipsos Murray Omnibus survey around whether people had an intention to volunteer in the future. For all types of volunteering, participation rates are expected to increase post-COVID-19. There's a 14% increase in overall volunteering from 45% pre-COVID-19 to 59% post-COVID-19. We know that there's methodology issues, asking people about their intentions. Things can change. We don't know to what extent the changes will materialise, but similar studies in the Republic and Northern Ireland have been reassuring in that they've found much the same, that there is an intention from people to volunteer more after COVID-19. And I'm going to pass back to Matthew for some overarching conclusions.
Thanks, Debbie. So yeah, just to wrap up then, what can we say from this sort of evidence base? I think, firstly, that we shouldn't forget the really important role, probably the most important, if you're looking at the actual contribution to health and well-being, the most important role that volunteering does is the volunteers helping other people. And the ones that you can get health and well-being benefits to the recipients or the beneficiaries of volunteering in all categories of volunteering, actually. But the three that we've highlighted here, I think, do stand out, particularly for formal volunteering. And when it comes to befriending, informal volunteering has got a major role to play. So it's been a real strength during COVID. Secondly, that volunteering supports the health and well-being of volunteers themselves. Now, we can have an interesting discussion on this. It is highly contested. It's a very good, interesting example of how difficult it is to undertake quantitative evidence to prove cause and effect. However, when we've looked at both the quant and the qual and reflected on it, and I think our judgment is that, yeah, I think there are definitely health and well-being benefits. I think it's more about who benefits rather than and how we can support those that most need it is really what we come out with. And that's what leads down to this bullet point. Those who are most disadvantaged are the most to gain. And these are just some of the examples that we came across in the literature review work that we did. And the irony is, and the sad irony is, that they are much less likely to be volunteers in the first place. The last slide, I think. And then, so, yeah, I think the other thing that's interesting when you look at what's happened since I've been in volunteering, I think the informal volunteering was seen as the poor cousin to formal volunteering. It really wasn't on the radar screen at all. But with some helpful relationship that we've got with the Scottish Government, and we're an advisory group to the stats team in the government on the Scottish Household Survey, we lobbied diligently for including informal volunteering as an important litmus test of society, and that was included for the first time in 2018. So we're starting to get an evidence base and understanding the contribution of helping your neighbours and friends and the people next door than just doing it through formal groups and organisations on formal volunteering. So I think that's been a real plus. And I think that what's shown through the COVID experience is that what was seen as, even when that data was shared, I was getting texts and stuff coming through from reputable charities that was saying, what are you bothering? We did a blog on informal volunteering. What are you doing talking about the importance of formal volunteering? You know, we're formal volunteering is where it's all at. And then I thought, you know, where are we now with COVID and what's happened during COVID? It really brings it home in spades at how important the informal volunteering access is to health and well-being, both for the volunteers themselves, but particularly for helping society and those that are isolated. And then I suppose to conclude, really, we can't get away from the importance of the known unknowns. And as I said, there's the cause and effect problem issue. There is a lack of longitudinal evidence. Although interestingly, the three papers that we looked at in our literature review back in 2018, it was interesting that they all three came out and said there was evidence. One of them was fairly modest or marginal. The other two did cite evidence, even taking into account for other explanatory factors. But it's still very much jury out on that. And then we also acknowledge there are gaps in our knowledge. We really don't know so much about informal health and well-being effects with regards to informal volunteering. We know much more about formal volunteering. It's been heavily researched. And this also links into issues associated with youth and midlife impact. There's far more research done on the impact and benefits to older people. And however, I would have to say that having done this research over the past 3 or 4 years, we would certainly caution, because the evidence we've looked at and the issues facing, say, for example, our young people, who are the most socially connected of any age demographic, are actually the second most lonely category in society. And if you look at the area on attraction and engagement and volunteering, I think that's a real focus for future research. And then last but not least, the linkage to community health and well-being. I mean, it's fascinating how the informal volunteering in COVID has actually, as part of an overall groundswell, brought communities together compared with where they've ever been, certainly for a lot of people's living memory. So I think there's some really interesting angles in regards to the locus between community well-being and individual well-being and the role that volunteering plays. And I'm just pleased to say that David Beaumark, who's on this call today, is helping us to unpick that and get to the bottom of that through his current PhD work at Strathclyde. So thank you very much. That concludes our presentation.